Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so basically, can you all tell me, like, two or three of you, what does it mean by when we are talking? So the topic is systemic hypertension. So what do you learn from this? What exactly am I telling you? So what is hypertension? What is a normal blood pressure, beyond which we call it as hypertension?
Uh, Ma'am, more than 140, 90. 140
Oh,
is systolic blood pressure and 90 diastolic blood pressure.
okay, very good. Now, what is the rationale behind making that as a cutoff? Now, there were a lot of, each year we have a joint national committee worldwide which they define blood pressure, and always there is some confusion over what to be taken as a minimum and a maximum. So why is such a confusion going on? So what is this? What is the importance of this cutoff? Anybody can answer. Now it's going to be,
So,
yes.
so that they might have seen that complications were much more likely about this particular level.
Yeah, so exactly, doctor. Your name, doctor?
Anashwara, ma'am.
Okay, excellent, excellent. What you told is excellent. So, whenever we plan what is the normal and beyond which it is abnormal, usually nowadays it's a concept of evidence-based medicine. So, they've done a lot of studies and they have found that if the BP is beyond that, the risks of complications is more. As we all know, no, this hypertension, the most important aspect is a very silent killer. No, when hypertension is there, nobody is bothered. When you land up with some target organ damage, that is the time we all start looking back. Now, what are the target organs when hypertension develops?
Hypertensive retinopathy,
Yes,
nephropathy,
yes,
stroke,
yes. So CNS,
cardiac,
eyes, cardiac, yes, excellent.
and
Then
stroke, brain, ma'am.
brain, yes. Then
CNS,
what else?
Renal system.
Yes, okay. Then your even peripheral vascular disease. No, it is a vascular etiology, so you have a lot of vascular problems associated with it. So it's sort of a very silent killer. So with this background, so I'll be covering in these topics. One is introduction. How do you make the accurate method of measurement of BP? Now that is a very important aspect. Now you have heard of terminologies called white coat hypertension. Now all of us know the moment we enter MBBS, know that you are a doctor. So they say yesterday we saw our BP was this much. What will happen? When I went to the doctor, it was so much. When I sit at home and check, it is so much. Everybody have equipments. No, that is the scenario what we are having. So how do we interpret? So before interpretation, we ourselves should know what is the accurate method of measurement of BP, so that we can arrive at a we can analyze and treatment, when should be initiated, when should you do a lifestyle modification, all that is important. Then of course the etiology of hypertension and pathophysiology, then how do you evaluate a patient with hypertension, and finally we finish with the management of the patient with hypertension. So going to hypertension, now all of us know it is one of the leading causes of death. And DALY worldwide, what is that DALY?
Disability adjusted life years.
Yes, disability adjusted life years. So important, no? It's not that just how we live our life, it is the disability what we are going to face. Now, so now you land up with a stroke. A 40-year-old male who lands up with a stroke, it's going to be a devastating consequence to the family. It's not only to him, to the family, the economy itself. And in the end, when you look at a wider aspect, even the country is going to be affected. So it's such an important thing that we should screen the patients, screen the individuals, screen the population. So, so that is the importance. Then 1 out of 8 deaths now in this, all this corona, and we are all sitting at home, and this we are having this Google Meet, and we are not even meeting. But silent killers, there are so many silent killers outside which can be preventable. how can it be preventable is we have to screen and identify earlier, and we have to give us education first. We ourselves should be well aware of what is going on, and the next we can we can go and treat outside, we can give a social education, and we can at least remove this silent killer. Now it is equivalent, a patient with hypertension with the target organ, sudden deterioration, they say that 5 years loss of life is there, and it is second only to cigarette smoking as a preventable cause of death. No, we always say don't smoke, smoking is hazardous. No, if next to cigarette smoking, when we have hypertension, I think we should give equal importance, and we ourselves should be aware of everything related to hypertension, and only when we are well trained, we can go and educate others. Now, what are the important points? No, it is a risk factor of coronary artery disease, as we already told. Then heart failure. So relevant to heart, we have so many problems. Then chronic kidney disease. Renal involvement in hypertension is another big thing. Now, hypertension can cause chronic kidney disease, or the first presentation of a renal disease can be hypertension. So either way, it has a very vicious link among themselves. Then next is stroke. That is cerebrovascular accident. Now, it is such a devastating thing. Now, all of you know, once I hope this corona gets over fast and you'll all be coming back to clinics and seeing cases, you'll see, a stroke patient, how much disability they're going to have. It is not only stroke. Hypertension can present in many ways. One, as a stroke, then it can come as hypertensive encephalopathy. Patient comes with an altered sensorium. Then in a stroke, it can come as a hemorrhagic and ischemic. Now, hemorrhagic stroke, what is the problem with hemorrhagic stroke is, that may be the first time we identify that they have such high BP. They've never have been screened. They'll say, doctor kita ponade illa. Now, is it an excuse when you have a patient who is going to die or going to have such a big disability? Then, of course, your peripheral arterial disease and retinopathy. Retinopathy, you have hypertensive retina. All of you are fresh from ophthalmology, so you know what are the changes you will get. Now, in that, when they have done a study, they found out for heart failure, 50% they found that hypertension is the cause of heart failure. Now, in other words, if we are going to screen and treat hypertension appropriately, we can at least reduce this, this amount of the morbidity which we are going to see with heart failure and stroke. If they have studied the stroke population, 40% of stroke was found out due to hypertension, and myocardial infarction, which is 25%. So in other words, when we are going to treat hypertension appropriately and correctly, we are going to reduce so many comorbidities related to it. So that is the importance of hypertension. Now they have done evidence-based medicine. They have done a lot of studies, and they have found out that in all your comorbidities, this non-communicable disease, hypertension forms a very important factor, which in addition to diabetes or diabetes alone are the major cause. That is why, we have NCD clinics where we do screening, and in Indian population, unfortunately, we have diabetes who are presenting very young in age. So, so that is the importance why this was, we have to know everything about it. Now, before going to hypertension, we have to know what is hypertension. That is, what is systemic hypertension. So the definition cannot be very, we say above 140/90 is normal. So there is a, JNC 7 criteria, there's a JNC 8 criteria, there's a European criteria, there's American criteria. So why so much the confusion is we don't know exactly at BP above which we are going to say, that is below which is normal and above which is abnormal. So when you talk in terms of definition, any chronically elevated BP above normal. Now, what is normal? So clinically, level of blood pressure at which the institution of therapy reduces BP related morbidity and mortality. Now, this is the definition, that is broad definition. Now, coming specifically, so there are a lot of criteria, blood pressure classifications based on this evidence-based medicine. So the latest classification, actually the latest has removed pre-hypertension. For all practical purpose, we'll take this as our marker. Now this normal is as they say in this classification, this is what we are going to take. This is what the standard textbook, that is Harrison, is giving. And as of now, this is what we are going to take as normal. So normal is when systolic is less than 120 and diastolic less than 80. Now, this terminology of pre-hypertension was brought in JNC 7 criteria. Now, this pre-hypertension is 120 to 139 and diastolic of 80 to 89. Stage 1 hypertension is from 140 to 159, 90 to 99. Stage 2 is above 160 of systolic and diastolic of more than 100. And the terminology of isolated systolic hypertension of more than 140 and a diastolic of less than 90. That is, there is a wide pulse pressure. Do you know what is pulse pressure? Somebody? What is pulse pressure?
Difference between the systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure.
Diastolic blood pressure. Now, where does this systolic hypertension, isolated systolic hypertension become very important? Which age group? Younger age group or older age group?
Younger, ma'am?
No, ma. It is in the older age group. Older age group, it is very important. Now, when we look carefully into it, there is a terminology called pre-hypertension, right? So, 120/80. Now, that is the standard we are going to keep is normal. Now, this pre-hypertension. Now, why are we giving it a term as pre-hypertension? That is hypertension not yet developed, but it is pre-hypertension. So, see, whenever we classify, we define, and all this, the basic purpose is to, give an appropriate treatment or a strategy to reduce hypertension. Now, what is the importance of that pre-hypertension? Now, suppose you check 30 plus, we are going to check everybody who is coming to Rajiv Gandhi Hospital. We are going to do a study of maybe for 1 month, all male and female around age of 30 to 35, we are going to check. In that, we found that 10% of population of this age group is having 130 and 90, that is 80 to 89 pre-hypertension. Now, what next we should do based on this classification? What can be done? What is the important
modification?
What, doctor?
Lifestyle modification.
Yeah, so this is the stage where we talk about pre-hypertension is the stage where we are going to talk about lifestyle modification. Like what?
Diet rich in low salt.
Okay, very good. What else can be advised?
Exercise.
Yes, so exercise, then your reducing alcohol consumption, smoking, then your reduction of stroke, maintaining the body weight, all that is a very important. And as you said, salt, very important. So the lifestyle modification, now the latest what this is, anybody, you bring this lifestyle modification for everybody. Now this is going to prevent a person going from pre-hypertension to hypertension stage. Now once the patient goes, there are 2 stages, that is stage 1 and stage 2. So, why the staging is stage 1, we are going to start the therapy accordingly, and stage 2 also, we are going to plan our management. Now, this isolated systolic hypertension, when previously, first, when they were saying that systolic blood pressure, is can be up to 150, 160 in old age, and it's not an issue. Then later they found out, they were telling diastolic is more important than systolic for your morbidity and your end organ damage. But later they found out in more than diastolic, of course diastolic is important, but isolated systolic hypertension per se had an independent marker, independent marker which can lead to increased mortality. That is why this terminology of this latest classification has isolated systolic hypertension. Now, more than this isolated systolic hypertension, it is also the wide pulse pressure with the isolated systolic hypertension is going to cause more of this morbidity. So this is the background for this blood pressure classification, which is followed of late. Okay, so all of you should know this classification. Now, yes, ma. Yes, ma.
That was JNC 7 classification.
Yes, ma. This is the JNC 7. Actually, the 8 has come. But for all practical purpose, all our textbook is still following this, and we will go by this.
Okay.
Should all cases of isolated systolic hypertension be treated?
Isolated systolic hypertension depends. Like if it is more than 60 years, definitely. But what they say is if it is more than 80 years, no, you can wait up to 150 to 160. And with
Okay.
comorbidities, it still has more, you have to treat. I'll come to that. We'll come later on. Okay.
Thanks.
Yes. Now, before going to all this pathophysiology and all, see, basically we are all clinicians. We are going to see how to measure BP. Now, why am I giving so much importance? Because diagnosis and management of hypertension is going to depend on that particular BP readings we are going to take. Now, a patient comes to our clinic, okay, or comes to our outpatient or comes to our ward in Rajiv Gandhi. Now, you take a BP. It comes out to 150/90 on a 40-year-old male who is a smoker and obese. What is your next plan? This is the first measurement we are taking. That person so far has not gone to any doctor or something, has come to us. Should we initiate treatment right away or what should we do?
Repeat the BP.
Why?
Because we take the average of the readings.
Okay, we have to take average of the reading. Why is it so? See,
It
first time
can
they
be
come
due
to
to
us.
physiological also.
Yeah, it can be physical. No, they may be stressed out. Natural, right? We ourselves, when we go to the doctor for the first time, we ourselves have that palpitation, some sympathetic activity which may be raised. But when we take maybe 2 or 3 readings, we ask them to wait for 15 minutes. Then if it is 150/90 and there is no major target organ involvement or damage or something, we ask them, okay, you follow this maybe lifestyle modification, come back again, and then again we check the BP. Still there is something called, this white coat hypertension. They come to our, our outpatient clinics and they have high BP. So there is a thing called, you can even check at home and come. Now there are two things. One, it can be a white coat hypertension when they come to the clinics and it can be raised. But when they record it at home, it can be abnormal. Another thing is in our clinics, it may be normal. But when they check at home, it will be elevated. That is called masked hypertension. So either way, it is going to be a risky thing. Okay. So here we are going to inappropriately treat the patient, and there we are not going to treat the patient. So there is two extremes of this. So let's first see how we are going to accurately measure the BP. So all of you have done it in physiology. It is going to be just a revision. So properly prepare the patient. What do you mean by properly prepare the patient? So preparing the patient, nothing, man. Patient comes to the clinic, he would have walked, maybe nowadays there is no buses and autos and all, he would have walked 1 kilometer and come, immediately make him sit and take BP. Will it come accurate?
We'll have to wait for 10 minutes.
At least for 10 to 15 minutes, no, you have to make the, make the patient relax, and then you have to check for the BP. It's a very important. Use proper technique for BP measurements. Now, proper technique means you make the patient sit, the heart should be at the, the table almost same, then the cuff should be proper. What is the ideal measurement of cuff to the arm?
80% of the arm circumference.
2/3, yeah. 2/3 it should be covered. Now, suppose it's an obese patient or a very thin-built patient, if you use a inappropriate, tourniquet, you're going to get a wrong measurement, right? Now, if it's a patient, you're making them lie supine, the BP should be kept appropriately. You cannot keep BP measure apparatus higher than that. All these, that is the techniques. Now, take the proper measurements needed for the diagnosis and treatment of elevated high BP and hypertension. Now, properly document accurate BP readings. That is 2 or 3 readings as and when required, and average the readings and provide the readings to the patient. Now, this is the era of, every time it's always nice to be, cordial with the patient. You introduce yourself to the patient, you tell what you are going to do, and then do the patient and discuss with the patient. We cannot just like that be rough and tough with them. Communication is a very important thing. Now, coming to the patient's preparation. So first, have the patient relax, sitting in a chair, feet on floor, back supported, at least minimum of 5 minutes. And Ideally, they should not have taken caffeine. Exercise means not that they go and do in the gym. No, they would have come walking. They would have come in a big, even if buses and trains are there, they would come in a big rush, or they would have come in a two-wheeler or a car or whatever it is. The stress will still be there. So we have to make them relax. And ideally, no caffeine and definitely no smoking and exercise. So make the patient relax at least 30 minutes before measurements. And ensure that patient has emptied his or her bladder, because that sympathetic part is there. And no talk during the period of rest or measurement. Ideally, you relax them. Wherever you're going to put the cuff placement, better that they don't have that sleeves, no, the covering should not be there. The proper technique. Definitely our sphygmomanometer has to be validated and periodically calibrated. That is, whatever machine we are having, no, all this should be done. Patient's arm should be supported on the table or in the supine, and place middle of the cuff on the patient's upper arm at the level of right atrium. That is, with the, you understand, no, I don't think I have to go in depth, and use the correct cuff size. That is, encircles 80% of the arm. Now, proper measurement is the most important thing. Is you have to measure the BP at both arms. No, there are so many things that we may miss. At least once you have to check both the arms, and use the arm with higher reading for subsequent measurements. And separate repeated measurements by 1 to 2 minutes. Now, this is like, it's not that everybody should have this sort of a thing. You have an idea. No, it is always an individual patient base. And always first do a palpatory method to estimate the systolic blood pressure. Then inflate the cuff 20 to 30 millimeter mercury above the level, and then deflate the cuff pressure slowly, that's 2 millimeter, and listen for correct cough sounds. So far, am I clear? Is there any doubt in this? I hope I'm clear, doctors, students.
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, ma. Now you know about this Korokov sound. Systolic blood pressure is the onset of the first Korokov sound, and diastolic blood pressure is defined as disappearance of all the Korokov sounds. Note the time of most recent BP medication taken before measurement. Now, the patient, no, mostly hypertensive patients may come for us, no, every month, repeated checkups, they will come. They may either have forgotten to take up the BP medication sometimes, no. So we should not see. Now I am seeing a patient. I record the BP as 170, 100. He's a regular, my regular patient. So I am in a hurry. I have some 20 patients waiting outside. All will be in a big hurry. So என்ன நீங்க சரியா இது பண்ணலையா? Okay, இந்த மாத்திரை போடுங்க, இது increase பண்ற, dose increase பண்றேன். We generally tend to remember what drugs we give, and I can send him off. But the problem is, maybe for last 1 week he would not have bought the drugs. Because of lockdown, he could not come to our government hospital to collect the medications. So all that should be noted before escalating or de-escalating the drug. Now that is the most important thing. History taking is important everywhere. Then use an average of more than 2 readings obtained on more than 2 occasions to estimate the individual level of BP. Now this usually what is when we are first time seeing the patient, always we take an average. Now suppose you are in a clinic, you can ask them to come tomorrow, just next time, again take, and then decide whether we are going to initiate any medications, or are we going to give lifestyle modification, or does the patient require admission. Now it is not that one BP recording and we are going to decide. So that's the importance of that step 5. And provide BP reading. Now this is an era of all this court and so many allegations and all that. So always document. At the end of the day, whatever we document it clearly. We are all these memes come with the doctor's handwriting and all that. I think no longer can be acceptable. It's not that you have to write beautifully, but whatever you write should be legible, so that the next time, even if the patient comes to you or goes to anybody else, they should be knowing very clearly what is going on about the patient, so that the next treatment or the next appropriate management to be done will be very clear. Now there are non-invasive method. Now the most important thing is ambulatory BP monitoring. That is record at regular intervals, that is 20 to 30 minutes over 24 to 48 hours. And next is the home BP measurement. Record BP by automated oscillometric devices. Now all these devices are available. These are important in this white coat hypertension. Now, how do you identify this white coat hypertension? They'll clearly tell us, உங்ககிட்ட வந்தாதான் எனக்கு பிபி ஏறுது, நான் வீட்ல இருந்தா நல்லா தான் இருக்கு. So we have to give credence, we have to give importance to what they are telling and ask them to record the BP, note it down in the in the piece of paper, bring it back to us, and then we can decide whether we have to treat or not. Now this is going in a big way and we have to give importance before initiating any management. Now next we are coming to the etiology of hypertension. Now all of you know that 80 to 95% is essential hypertension. Now what do you mean by this primary or essential hypertension?
Idiopathic.
So one is idiopathic. Of course it is idiopathic, but beyond that,
There's only hypertension and nothing else can be associated
made out.
with.
So you don't identify like secondary causes. Next it is coming, no, renal or other, aldosteronism, your obstructive sleep apnea, nothing is there. But what they say is there is a genetic and environmental factor. Now it is not totally idiopathic, means we don't know anything. So there is a genetic factor and environmental, what do you call that, epigenetics. Now what they say is hypertension is there is some epigenetic dysregulation. Now what is the importance in our scenario of managing the patient is, we are genetically prone. Okay, we take a subpopulation which is genetically prone, but if that genetically prone patient becomes obese, that genetically prone patient is going to take a lot of salt. Now those patients are going to land up with hypertension earlier. So that is the basis for this lifestyle modification. So if a patient, even if a patient is genetically prone to develop hypertension earlier, this environmental factor can reduce your genetic proneness, and hence at least reduce the end organ damage or end organ problems associated with hypertension. Am I clear? Am I clear of what I told? Is
Yes,
it clear? So what they say is there is a genetic determinant for target organ damage. Now, see, when you take 100 patients who are going to get hypertension, not all of them are going to land up with kidney, renal problems. Not all of them are going to come with stroke. So they say there is a genetic factor which make them prone to develop stroke, prone to develop renal disease. Now, this proneness can be prevented by giving that lifestyle modification. So there is a genetic component and environmental factors, both which are relevant. Now, when you talk about, when you see this primary hypertension, it can be where, this renin is a very important factor. No, renin, angiotensin 2, aldosterone axis. That axis is very important, plays a very big role in our hypertension. When we take a primary hypertension patient and see the renin, it can be low renin or high renin. Now, the importance of this is for low renin hypertensive patient in an idiopathic setting, the drugs is going to be different. For high renin, there is a genetic and environment. That is a concept developed for primary or essential. Now, secondary hypertension, what is the commonest cause?
Renal cause.
Renal cause. Excellent, doctor. So, suppose a 30-year-old male comes with hypertension, 20-year-old male or female lands up with hypertension, the first thing we are going to think of is renal cause. The same thing in a 50 or 60-year who is going to come first with hypertension, of course, renal can be the cause, or renal damage can be due to the hypertension. So renal is very closely linked, and we should always examine or always do a laboratory investigation to find out any damage in the renal involvement. So the common causes are, of course, renal parenchymal disease, renovascular disease, more common. Then primary, this wrongly thing, it's a primary aldosteronism. Then of course, the big way of obstructive sleep apnea, previously snoring leads on to all this so much big problems of hypertension, and hypertension leading on to target organ damage. So unless we look for it or we have it in our back of our mind, we may miss it. And of course, the drugs or alcohol induced. What the illegal drugs can lead on to hypertension?
Amphetamine.
Very good. What else? Cocaine. No, all these drugs, abuse drugs. No, they will be happy when, as long as they are taking cocaine and all that. When they come with withdrawal, no, they come with this hypertensive emergency or hypertensive encephalopathy. All that. No, unless we have it in our back of our mind, we are going to miss it. And of course, alcohol binge, alcohol induced. No, you can have the hypertension. Now, whenever we talk of secondary hypertension, as such, secondary hypertension is less. But in that, the common causes is always renal. You should think of always kidney. And next is primary aldosteronism. We should never forget the obstructive sleep apnea and alcohol and drugs. No, unless you have it in back of your mind, you may miss it. Now, these are the uncommon causes. Now, you know this, no? Pheochromocytoma. How does a pheochromocytoma patient present?
Increased catecholamines, norepinephrine.
Yeah. So now see, clinically, how does a patient present to us in the hospital?
Episodic hypertension.
Very good. So patient will be sudden episodes of giddiness, sudden episode of increased sweating. No, so it is a episodic, and you can have a postural hypotension. That is, when I'm lying in the bed, I'm fine. When I immediately get up from bed, I have this giddiness. I tend to fall. All this gives you a clue that are we dealing, especially in a young patient. You have to think of pheochromocytoma. Then you may have this, all this. What do you say? Emotional outburst. Suddenly, I'm doing all that. No, if it is in this periodic pattern. And when you're in your clinic, you're checking this high BP is so high with the high wide pulse pressure. No, you have to think in terms of pheochromocytoma or paraganglioma. Cushing syndrome, what is it due to? Cushing's, what is it due to, man? Secondary causes? Steroid abuse? Okay, you have to think of that. Then, of course, hypothyroidism. Now, this coarctation of aorta is a very rare cause. And how do you make out clinically coarctation of aorta?
Brachiofemoral index.
Okay, that is one clinically, man, in the OP and when you are doing your clinics, checking for all the
Radiofemoral delay.
Doctor, tell me.
Radiofemoral delay.
Yes. Radiofemoral delay. Coarctation of aorta is, the most of the time it is picked up by the junior residents in the hospital. No, house surgeons will tell us first, madam, different inge vera mari indhathu, inge vera mari, no. So unless we look for it, we may miss it. Second is when you take a BP recording of both the arms, no, you may pick up the difference. Okay. So next is, of course, primary hyperparathyroidism, your congenital adrenal hyperplasia. These all present in the pediatric age group. Rare is your mineralocorticoid excess syndrome, acromegaly. All these are rare causes, but still you have to, secondary hypertension, young person comes with the hypertension. Before labeling them as primary hypertension, we have to find out the secondary cause. Why is it important to find out the secondary cause of hypertension?
They may not respond to normal ARBs.
Yes, very good. In a renovascular disease, when we are going to give ACE and ARB, we are going to worsen. No, we will precipitate renal failure in such patient. One. Then what else is the cause? What else is the importance of finding out secondary hypertension?
Treatment of the primary cause would resolve the...
Excellent. Yes. So now when we treat the primary cause, you are going to give the person a normal life. Whereas in a primary hypertension or the essential hypertension, they are going to be lifelong medication. Here you are going to identify the cause and treat the cause. Once you treat the cause, the patient can be off medication and you are going to cure the disease. So that is the importance of your finding out secondary hypertension, especially this secondary hypertension, especially young people. That is how they land up. So again, the causes it is put up. So renal is, parenchymal disease, polycystic kidney disease. What is the age group of presentation of a polycystic kidney disease? Any idea, man?
Second,
40 years.
Yes, 40 years. Excellent, doctor. Whoever present told was an excellent answer. Usually around 40 years of age, usually as an abdominal mass with a high BP. When you palpate the abdomen, you can pick up the enlarged kidney. Then renal tumors, of course, and obstructive uropathy. Renovascular is your fibromuscular dysplasia and arteriosclerotic. Now, renovascular, very important. We have to rule out all the causes. One, you can find out by examination by seeing a bruit. Around the umbilicus, you auscultate and hear the bruit. There is a narrowing, renal artery, narrowing due to fibromuscular dysplasia. So unless we are very careful and look for it, or incidentally when they do an ultrasound, they'll find that one side the kidney is small in size, other side the kidney may be normal in size. So that means the kidney is already damaged because of this renovascular involvement. So either way, you should have that in the back of your mind. Of course, adrenal, you have this, all this, primary aldosteronism, Cushing's, all this 17 alpha hydroxylase deficiency, 11 beta hydroxylase, all these are pediatric age group presentation with enzymatic deficiencies. Then the coarctation of aorta, obstructive sleep apnea, then in pregnancy, preeclampsia, eclampsia, now others neurogenic, usually acute spinal cord section or acute spinal cord injury that may cause neurogenic rise in the BP. Now that you should have. Then rare like porphyria, lead poisoning. And of course, hypothyroidism can be associated with hypertension, and medications, very important. That is your steroids, tricyclic antidepressants. A lot of people are taking antidepressants and they may hide it from you. So unless we go into depth of the history and find out, that may be the cause. So when we stop the drug, we are going to, at least reduce the BP unit and unnecessarily add other drugs. And your erythropoietin, where do we give erythropoietin?
CKD associated
Yes.
anemia.
So for CKD, we know that decreased erythropoietin, it is generally given. Now erythropoietin per se will cause hypertension. Renal cause, even kidney disease is going to have high BP. So we should be very careful. So we should find out what is the cause for sudden rise in BP. So unless we know this drug is going to cause, we may not, look for it. And of course, I said cocaine, anti-inflammatory, all these painkillers, all that. Now coming to the pathophysiology. So broadly, I'm going to just rush through it. I mean, it's physiology which you should know, because our treatment of all the drugs is going to act at particular points. So unless we know the pathophysiology, we will not understand how the drug is going to act at that level. Now, intravascular volume, we are going to talk everything about what is the cardiac output, what is the peripheral vascular resistance, autonomic nervous system, sympathetic, parasympathetic, alpha, beta, and renin-angiotensin, aldosterone axis. Now, when we take a blood pressure, that is arterial blood pressure, now it is basically, that is arterial blood pressure is dependent on, we know this, cardiac output into peripheral vascular resistance determines your arterial pressure. Correct? Am I correct? Hello? So now the cardiac output depends on the stroke volume and the heart rate. Now suppose you run. So we need more oxygen. So the circulation increases. So what happens first when you run or when you increase exercise?
Heart rate increases.
Yes, very good. So the heart rate increases and the stroke volume. So when your heart rate increases per minute, the amount of blood flowing is going to increase, and you're going to get a more cardiac output, more oxygen will reach your muscles, and you're going to get oxygenation. One way is that. Second is, when there is an increased peripheral vascular resistance also, your BP is going to increase. Now this peripheral vascular resistance depends on the vascular structure and the function. Now, whenever we talk of volume, no, intravascular volume, what is the electrolyte, what is the salt which is most important, responsible for intravascular volume?
Sodium.
Sodium. Now, that is why the salt becomes a very important factor for the decrease in blood pressure. Now, what I say about salt is the sodium chloride. Now, this chloride, this sodium chloride is the one which is going to, increase the intravascular volume and increase the blood pressure and cause all the problems related to it. And usually there is a minimal requirement of sodium, and beyond that, and that too, whatever sodium which we are going to give, they say it is better to give in a non-chloride form rather than the chloride form. So initial elevation of blood pressure in response to vascular volume expansion may be related to increase at cardiac output. Now this is how the the whole vicious cycle starts. Now this sodium chloride dependent hypertension, it can be due either to decreased capacity of kidney to excrete sodium or intrinsic renal disease. One, it can be that renal, because of renal disease, sodium is not excreted, or genetically, people are reducing there is a decreased capacity of excretion of sodium. That is why when we are going to management, in the management, if you see, the first drug of choice, now the latest guidelines will give you as a diuretic. Salt losing diuretic like thiazides are given. That is, the aim is to prevent this as a cause of rise of blood pressure. Then, of course, so this is basics about this. Next, we'll go to renin, angiotensin, and aldosterone axis. All of you know this this cycle. So what happens is angiotensinogen is there. When there is renin secretion, angiotensin 1, and angiotensin 1 with the effect of ACE is going to convert it to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is a vasoconstrictor. It's a potent vasoconstrictor. Now this will go and act at angiotensin T1 receptor, AT1 receptor and T2 receptor. Now this T1 receptor, when it activates in the kidney, it is going to cause a release of aldosterone. And aldosterone will cause retention of sodium and increase the intravascular volume. Angiotensin 2 is going to cause vasoconstriction. In effect, when there is a sympathetic activity, your BP raises. Now this axis, so this contributes to the regulation of arterial pressure primarily via the vasoconstricting properties of angiotensin 2 and sodium retaining properties of aldosterone. Now this axis goes on mainly, where does it occur? Mainly in the kidney. Why nobody is responding? Where is renin secreted?
Renin and kidney, ma'am.
Renin in kidney. Okay, so
AS enzyme in lungs.
Okay, what is the importance of this angiotensin 2? Now, angiotensin 2 is going to act everywhere, and this aldosterone. Now, this aldosterone is going to act everywhere, and they say that aldosterone not only affects your kidney, it is also going to have it is pro-atherosclerotic. So what is basically causing a mild, just increase in BP is causing a widespread vascular changes in effect. So this is the importance of renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. Now this renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system also gets activated in your congestive heart failure. Am I right?
Yes,
That is
yes, ma'am.
secondary aldosteronism. But there the BP does not rise. Whereas when it is renal disease related, you are going to have this rise in BP. Now this increased aldosterone secretion also causes hypokalemia and alkalosis. Now aldosterone beyond, it will cause effects in the cardiovascular system, which causes fibrosis, endothelial dysfunction, inflammation, oxidative stress, and aldosterone raise is an independent marker of cardiovascular morbidity and mortality. So what is what drug is that aldosterone antagonist?
Spironolactone.
Yes. So spironolactone has a very good, it is a good drug which we have used many places, and even in a left ventricular hypertrophy, they say it has an independent protective factor to prevent the remodeling of the heart. So where we start and where we end, no, that so much is there. Then this mineralocorticoid receptors are not only in the heart, I mean in the kidney, it is also there in the heart. So that is why this remodeling, all this is affected, and when you give aldosterone antagonist, it is going to be a protective factor. So then, of course, you should know about vascular mechanisms, which I have not, we have not mentioned. Now, in this vascular mechanisms, what they say is this: when the arterial, because of atherosclerosis and old age, it becomes thick. No, it becomes stiff because of some calcification and stiffness. Now the problem is when you are going to go and go and check a BP of a 70 or 80-year-old who is atherosclerotic. So when you check the BP measurement, because of the stiffness, you may get a elevated systolic pressure, which is not so much actually. So that you should always keep in your mind when you are going to check a BP in an old age person. Then next is autonomic nervous system. Now, autonomic nervous system, what is the importance? What are the receptors you have? Alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1 and beta 2. Okay. So now these, each drug which is going to, now beta 1, what is the action of beta 1 receptor? Beta 1, what does it cause?
Increased heart rate, ma'am?
Yes, so increases the cardiac contraction. What does beta 2 cause?
Bronchodilation.
Excellent. So bronchodilation and vasodilatation. Alpha 1?
Vasoconstriction.
Very good. Alpha vasoconstriction. Alpha 2?
It's a central nervous system receptor.
Yes, yes. So there are so many. Why am I asking all these questions is because when you are going to give a drug, no, we are going to give beta blockers, alpha blockers. So unless we know the pathophysiology, we will not be able to understand how it is going to act. So next, we'll go to the clinics now. Patient evaluation. Now, when a person comes to our clinic, so what is the basic idea? First, we have to identify if there is any target organ damage. Now we have checked the BP. We have checked the BP twice or thrice and found out what is the if there is real rise in BP or in the pre-hypertension state. All that we are going to find out, and then we are going to we have found out the patient is having hypertension. Now the next evaluation point is we have to identify if there is a target organ damage and identify possible secondary cause of hypertension. Unless we look for it, we may miss it. And assist in planning an effective treatment regimen. Now there are so many regimen which is available. What is right for this patient? We are the particular person we are going to start. So when we go to the history, now primary hypertension, usually there is slow and gradual rise of BP. Then all this weight gain, high sodium diet, decreased physical activity, high alcohol, all these are the important history you're going to ask. And of course, the genetic component, I told it is both genetic and environmental. Then family history of hypertension. Now for secondary hypertension, how are you going to pick up whether it is primary or secondary? One is the BP liability rather. No, what we said, sudden, it is an episodic pallor and dizziness. If such a thing comes, pheochromocytopenia. You see one patient, you'll never forget it. For obstructive sleep apnea, of course, it is snoring and hypersomnolescence. And prostatism, what is the importance? Prostate hypertrophy may lead on to post-renal urinary tract obstruction. Okay. So, old male, like around 60-year-old male who comes with hesitancy, decreased frequency of urination and all, no. So you just don't see, as an organ wise, you have to see whether there is some post-renal damage also, no. Most of them, they don't come unless they have significant symptoms. Then of course, hypokalemia for your primary or secondary hypoaldosteronism, because increase in aldosterone is going to cause decrease in the potassium level. So it may cause muscle cramps and weakness. And of course, hypothyroidism of weight loss, palpitation, hyperthyroidism. Then for kidney disease, it may be due to edema, fatigue, frequent urination, or it can be an oliguria. Either way it can be. Coarctation, usually in pediatric age group itself, they would have found and they would have treated. So if there is a residual hypertension, then your Cushing syndrome of central obesity, facial rounding, easy bruisability, then medication and substance abuse, alcohol, NSAIDs. NSAIDs will be very common. Older age group, this pain, that pain, they'll take a lot of NSAIDs and they'll end up with hypertension. And not only hypertension, interstitial nephritis, all the damages can be there. Cocaine and amphetamines, drug abuse, and of course, then there is an absence of family history in a young individual that itself becomes an important factor. Now, secondary cause, again, the same thing. I needn't go through it. So then we go for, after taking history taking, we are going to go to the physical examination. So it should be an accurate measurement of BP. We already discussed how we are going to do. And then we are going to go for the assessment of hypertension. And attention should be paid to physical features that suggest secondary hypertension. What are the physical features we are going to look for? Somebody can answer.
Obesity.
Obesity, okay, fine.
Fatigue, weakness.
Enamma?
Fatigue and weakness.
Okay, fatigue and weakness, abdominal mass, what we all discussed. So abdominal mass, skin pallor, you anemic patient with abdominal mass, renal parenchymal involvement, edema. Then on auscultation, if there's a bruit, I already told you for renovascular, important around the umbilicus, you can have a bruit, so abdominal carotid or femoral artery. Then atrial fibrillation, one of the complications, common complication, arrhythmia. Atrial fibrillation, tell me some causes of atrial fibrillation. What?
Severe mitral stenosis.
Excellent. So severe mitral stenosis, then? Why only mitral stenosis? No other cause?
Old
Atrial
age.
fibrillation. 10 causes. I should start asking like this, I think.
Digoxin toxicity.
Digoxin toxicity will cause some arrhythmias, okay, but atrial fibrillation. So, okay, it can be coronary artery disease, it can be hypertension, it can be a lone atrial fibrillation of old age, it can be due to hyperthyroidism. Okay, please, all of you read up about atrial fibrillation. It will be asked in clinics. Okay, any patient with mitral stenosis can have, like as rightly said, atrial fibrillation. You should know in and out of atrial fibrillation in your clinics, up as well as in your theory. Okay, all of you please go and read up about that. Then of course obstructive sleep apnea, then your drugs. So fine tremor, tachycardia, sweating, abdominal pain, drug abuse, alcohol, all that you should look for it in the physical features. Now then next we diagnose as hypertension, we are going to go the laboratory test. Now here laboratory test I'd like to keep stressing, which I always stress to all the batches and all the students is, don't go for just like, they give a panel of tests which can be tested. You should know what investigation you are going to give. For each investigation, you should know what you are going to interpret. So what are the basic laboratory tests you are going to do for all the patients with hypertension? Then what are the optional ones, that is depending on whatever the patient is, and what are the additional tests we are going to do. So with this background, we'll go for laboratory test. Now all newly diagnosed hypertensive. So what are we going to see? Cardiovascular disease risk factor profiling has to be done, and to establish a baseline for medication use, because one particular medicine may cause some problems. So you should know so liver is normal before giving a drug, so that if liver failure occurs, it is a drug related liver failure, for example. Then for screening, so this is our aim for. So what are the basic tests? So we want to rule out diabetes, so fasting blood sugar. Then we do a complete blood count. Then we do a lipid profile. This lipidemia we want to find out. Then renal, always start with renal. Renal parameters very important. Then we are going to see for the electrolytes. Then thyroid has to be evaluated. Then we go for urine analysis. So what is the range when we call it as microalbuminuria?
30 to 300 milligrams.
Yes, 30 to 300. Microalbuminuria is just like a window. You know that the renal damage is occurring. Now, when it is in a microalbuminuria stage, when you give certain drugs like ACE and all, we can prevent a further progression to nephropathy and all. So that is the important thing. That is why we are going to, the patient will have frank proteinuria. Now you can at least prevent the further progression. And of course, the baseline ECG has to be done. Then optional is depending on the target organ damage. For example, if eye is involved, you are going to go for your eye examination. Then suppose if it is a peripheral arterial disease, so depending on the target, and now suppose if it is a CNS problems like stroke, according to it, we will have to go for CT brain. Not all patients you are going to go, depends on the target organ damage. Then optional testing, echo, if cardiac involvement is much, then uric acid, then ACR, albumin to creatinine ratio, depends on this each. So with the basic panel and with the patient history and examination, we are going to go for further tests. So then your additional test is to increased hypertension severity. So if there is, when do you go for additional test? When there is poor response to standard treatment approach, we have an approaches of treatment, which I'm going to tell. Now, if they don't respond, we have to find out where we are missing and disproportionate severity of target organ damage for the level of BP. 150, 100 and patient lands up with severe, definitely 150, 100 is not the cause. So there is something else. So we have to look for it. And historical and clinical clues that support a secondary cause. So for all this, so what are all the other tests you can do is renal ultrasound, renal MRA, abdominal CT, plasma and aldosterone renin ratio, 24 hours of urinary fractionated metanephrines. What do we do that for? This 24 hours urinary fractionated metanephrines.
Fear promoted.
Excellent, excellent. And overnight dexamethasone suppression test, what do we do that for? Cushing's. So it is not for all the patients you started this panel and do, no, it is, we have to, as a clinicians, have to decide. So that is the importance. Now we have done all the tests. We have taken a good history. We have, finally arrived at, fairly, we are fairly sure where we are going to put either the patient is in a pre-hypertensive, stage 1, stage 2, systolic hypertension, or a patient in secondary. So now we are going to go for how are we going to manage such hypertension. Now we go to the treatment strategies. One is non-pharmacological, then pharmacological and special consideration. So normal patient is 120/80. So nowadays what they say is optimal lifestyle habits. They say all of us should follow this lifestyle. It's not only for pre-hypertensive or a normal BP come with some other problem. Everybody. Okay, but especially these people you reassess in 1 year. Now that is in pre-hypertensive phase of 120, 129, less than 80. Non-pharmacological therapy, you reassess 3 to 6 months. Now the patient is in diabetes or patient has a chronic kidney disease. If such a patient, that is with comorbidities, our BP goal is to reduce less than 130/80. Now patient is in stage 1 hypertension. There is a clinical atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, or the estimated 10 years risk of cardiovascular disease is more than 10%, means directly we go for non-pharmacologic plus pharmacologic therapy. That is, we give them lifestyle modification. Along with that, we will have to give some drug and reassess after 1 month and 3 to 6 months and further intensify the drug. Whatever drug we are going to decide early, I'll tell later, but this strategy has to be followed. Now patient is in stage 2. Definitely one drug has to be started. And nowadays it's area of combination therapy. Should be treated carefully, promptly treated, carefully monitored, and you can escalate or de-escalate and control the BP, and always should be reassessed every 3 to 6 months. And we should advise, assess, optimize, and see to it that adhere to the therapy, because we have to plan whether we have to intensify or decrease. They cannot, if they don't adhere to the therapy, that becomes a very difficult factor. One, it can be difficult. Second is, if the BP is not maintained, they may later on come up with a target organ damage. And once the damage is occurred, it is very difficult. Now, what are the non-pharmacological interventions we can do? One is weight loss. So ideal body weight is the best go. Okay, they say that 1 millimeter of mercury reduction is occurs when they reduce the body weight, they say. And DASH, that is, what do you say? You, in a one plate, you should have a lot of fruits, vegetables, whole grain, all that. That is the regimen you have to take. And optimal is low sodium diet. And you can give increased potassium and calcium. So enhance the intake of dietary potassium, but should be avoided if, of course, when there is a kidney disease. And regular aerobic dynamic resistance or isometric resistance exercise at least 3 days a week. And reduce alcohol to less than 2 drinks per day daily for men and less than 1 drink for women. So lifestyle modification. So weight reduction, they say you have to maintain an ideal BMI, salt reduction of less than 6 grams, then DASH type of dietary plan, moderate alcohol consumption, and regular aerobic activity, that is brisk walking, is more than enough. Now there are few drugs. Primary agent drugs are thiazide diuretics, ACAI. ACAI is angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors. ARB is angiotensin receptor blockers, and CCB is calcium channel blockers. Now, previously we used to all put beta blocker also in the primary agent, but nowadays beta blocker is not recommended as first line agents unless the patient has ischemic heart disease or heart failure. So beta blocker has come down because what are the side effects of beta blocker? What can it cause?
It can worsen dyslipidemia.
Yes, that is why. With dyslipidemia, your diabetes and all that stuff, no? Then if a patient is asthmatic, I mean, there are so many things that beta blocker has now come as it is not a primary agent. Now it is, especially, of course, but in ischemic heart disease, we have to give beta blocker. But otherwise, the primary agent now, the star of the day is your thiazide diuretic because it causes sodium excretion. In fact, nowadays, if you see all the combination drug, thiazide or hydrochlorothiazide will be a must in the combination therapy or triple therapy. Also, there should be one diuretic associated. That is how the treatment is, that is how the approach is now in the principles of drug therapy. Now, whenever we start with a single agent, but in stage 2, we can consider 2 drugs of different classes. Now, that is a backbone. No, this is, you should always remember when we are going to start the treatment. But always remember the patient-specific factors. For example, age. Now, if always, my choice will always be ACEI, that is angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor. Now, a patient is 70-year-old and a patient is 50-year-old. For a 50-year-old, I'll prefer angiotensin converting enzyme, ACEI. But in a 70-year-old, I'll be careful. Why? Why? What is the side effect of ACEI?
Kidney.
Stenosis.
It can cause hyperkalemia. Okay, and older age, even though the renal creatinine will be normal, but the EGFR is definitely reduced as the person ages. Now, in such a person, if I give ACEI and precipitate renal failure, I mean, it's not fair. So, in a 70-year-old male, I'm going to prefer a calcium channel blocker, whereas in a 50-year person, I'll prefer a ACEI. So, age is a very important factor. Then concurrent medications. Some persons will adhere to some person may not adhere. So according to that, we'll have to see. So drug adherence, drug interaction, or overall treatment regimen. Then cost is very important. No, I cannot write a very costly drug to depends on the economy and comorbidities. So all these factors have to be considered. Otherwise, patient will take drug for one day and forget it. So when there is a primary prevention for cardiovascular complication, lowering BP becomes more important. Any drug you give, we have to lower the BP and prevent cardiovascular complication. Now, secondary cardiovascular protection with underlying comorbid illness, that is compelling indication. Not all hypertensive provide the same benefit. Now, I'll go into this. Now, when we come to the primary antihypertensive, thiazide, that is the #1 drug. Why? Because it reduces sodium. Of course, it will reduce potassium also, uric acid and calcium level. So use it in caution with the history of gout. You should be very careful, but it's a very good drug. Usually we use it as a combination only. Then ACE inhibitor and ARB. Now these are the the heroes after this thiazide. Now what is that name of this direct renin inhibitor?
Aliskiren.
Yes, aliskiren. Now it's a very good drug. It has come to the market, but you cannot give all these three in a combination. The ACE, ARB, and then you are going to kill the patient only. So you should be very careful in use together. You cannot use together because now it increases hyperkalemia, especially in a patient with CKD or those with potassium supplement. Now, if there is other drugs, so you should be careful. It's a very good drug, but you should know which patient you are going to use. In a renal artery stenosis, that is in a renovascular disease, you are going to prefer acute renal failure. And when there is a history of angioedema, you should not give ACE inhibitors. And you should avoid in pregnancy. What else will cause if you give ACE inhibitor? It may cause increased cost. Yes, why?
Bradykinin
Bradykinin. Yeah. So even the best of drugs has all the side effects which you should be careful before initiating. Now, calcium channel blocker. Older age group, I will prefer calcium channel blocker. Amlodipine. So, nifedipine, no. But amlodipine, yes. So, avoid in patient with nowadays heart failure we classify as reduced ejection fraction, normal ejection fraction. That is how you are going to. Now, but reduced ejection fraction, calcium channel blockers, you should be very careful. But amlodipine is a very safe drug, can be used. But it causes pedal edema. How does it cause pedal edema?
Venodilation.
Venodilation. Yeah, it is not because of increased salt and all. It's just a venodilatation. So you should pre-warn the patients, and if they are unhappy, you'll have to switch the drug. Other drugs are diltiazem, verapamil, but we are very careful because it causes bradycardia. So only when there is arrhythmia, we use, and we have to be very careful with reduced ejection fraction. Now, with the patient with comorbidities, what are the drug of choice? Now, if it is a coronary artery disease or post-myocardial infarction, beta blocker will be the first choice. And then, of course, ACEI and ARB. Now, if there is increase only in systolic hypertension, of course, these are the drug of choice. Diastolic hypertension, okay. Now, in diabetic, ACE is a very, ACE not only decreases the BP, it has a cardioprotective, renoprotective, CNS protection. So for all that purpose, so ACE becomes the first drug of choice in all the other condition, if you look at it. Of course, along with thiazide, because you want to reduce the calcium. And kidney disease also, initial phase, you can give ACE with ARB. That is when there is a nephropathy. But once the creatinine starts rising, we are going to stop it and go for calcium channel blockers. Now, stroke and or TIA, of course, ACEI with thiazides. Now coming to resistant hypertension. What is resistant hypertension? That is BP of more than 130/80 and the patient on more than 3, that is either 3 or more antihypertensives at optimal dose, which includes a diuretic, or BP less than 130/80, but patient requires more than 4 antihypertensives. If such a patient, we are going to term it as resistant hypertension. Now, the important point before terming a patient as resistant hypertension is you have to exclude the pseudo-clear resistance. Now, that is where you have to accurately measure BP, and before labeling them as resistant hypertension, we go for ambulatory, BP monitoring and home monitoring. And of course, you have to look for non-adherence. We have to exclude white coat effect. Now, before labeling them, we have to do all this before labeling a person as resistant hypertension. And once we have labeled them, again we have to reassess and see whether we have missed out any secondary cause like CKD, primary aldosteronism, renovascular disease, pheochromosis. All these, again you have to revisit. Again you have to test. Are we missing some secondary cause? And once we have found out that we have not missed, then we increase the diuretics, add an aldosterone antagonist like spironolactone, add other, go for alpha blockers, or you have to go for potent diuretics like either you loop diuretic like furosemide in CKD or potent vasodilators. Normally we don't use, but in such group we will have to go for potent vasodilators. Now, what is hypertensive crisis? So, when the systolic blood pressure is more than 180 and or diastolic blood pressure of more than 120 millimeter of mercury. Now, this is becomes a crisis when the target damage has occurred. If it has occurred, you call it as hypertensive emergency. If it has not occurred, but any time it may occur, you call it as urgency, or it is a markedly elevated BP. So, in a hypertensive emergency. Now, tell me an example of hypertensive emergency.
Hemorrhagic stroke, no?
Yeah, hemorrhagic stroke. Now, a person comes with ischemic stroke or a hemorrhagic stroke, BP is very high. Now, what is that? You should know some basics of treatment for hemorrhagic stroke. Now, a patient comes with 220, 180. Now, suppose the patient is having a hemorrhage and it is a hypertensive emergency, the target organ damage has occurred in the form of stroke. Now, we want to reduce the BP. Do you want to reduce it to 120, 80?
We have to gradually decrease it.
Yeah, so it is our aim should not be to immediately reduce. Now, suppose 220, 130 or 240, 130. We are going to first 25% reduction a bit fast, like in a hemorrhagic. After that, it should be slowly reduced such that the BP is maintained around 180, 100. Now, why do you want to maintain 180, 100 in a stroke? What they say is the cerebral, there is a mechanism, protective mechanism going on in the cerebral perfusion. Already because of this hemorrhagic stroke or ischemic stroke, that balance is lost. The cerebral perfusion pressure, all this goes in a very haywire. So when we abruptly decrease the BP, that hemorrhagic stroke may further worsen, or it may turn, ischemic stroke may widen. So you have to be very careful in reducing the BP when there is a stroke and all. No, so maintain the BP around 180, 160 to 180, or diastolic around 100 for 3 to 5 days till the cerebral perfusion pressure settles down, and after that you reduce the BP gradually. So when we are going to plan for the target organ damage treatment in a hypertensive crisis, you should be very careful. So what are the target organ damage in heart? Left ventricular hypertrophy. Now, the problem with left ventricular hypertrophy is it is an independent marker of mortality. The presence of LVH indicates there is chances of increased mortality. So that much importance we give to left ventricular hypertrophy. So other target organ damage is your angina. Then already a patient who has revascularized subsequently lands up with angina. Heart failure. In brain, it is stroke, transient ischemic attack, chronic kidney disease, peripheral arterial disease, your retinopathy. So all these is your target organ damage. Then your, of course, metabolic syndrome, you should know. Okay, I'm not going to detail. Now, a patient comes with hypertension emergency, we admit in the intensive care unit. And of course, you have to look for aortic dissection, in pregnant ladies, preeclampsia, eclampsia, pheochromocytoma crisis. Now, if such is there, only in aortic dissection, preeclampsia and pheochroma, these are the only conditions where you are going to reduce it to less than 140, 120. But otherwise, our basic aim in any other hypertensive emergency, apart from these three, we maintain around 160, 100 or 180, 100 for next 24 to 48 hours. So we should be clear, except for these three conditions, we'd rather like to maintain around 180, 100 or 160, 100. Now, in this scenario of a hypertensive emergency, what are the IV antihypertensives you can give or available? One is labetalol. So, so where you give, what is the dose you can look for? Where is it contraindicated? Is in a patient with COPD. You should be very careful. It is especially useful in hyperadrenergic syndromes. But in a patient who is already having a second or third degree heart block or bradycardia, you should be very careful. So you should know the pros and cons before using labetalol. It's a very good drug. It can we use it, but you should know where not to give. Rather, enalapril, of course, very good drug, but only in pregnancy, acute MI, and renovascular disease should not be used. Okay. Then nitroprusside, very good drug, and it rapidly reduces the BP. But you should be very careful. No, intra-arterial BP monitoring is important. And tachyphylaxis. What is tachyphylaxis? Anybody knows what is tachyphylaxis?
Increased dose is required for producing the effect.
Excellent. So the same effect, no, we start giving this, especially nitroglycerin and all that, no. First 6 hours, there's a good response. Beyond that, how much ever you give, the BP is not reducing. You know, there is a tachyphylaxis. So that is the time when you stop the drug, wait for some time, start another drug, and then only give. Otherwise, because of this tachyphylaxis, you'll be increasing the dose, and that may cause, that may cause toxicity of the same drug. So you should be very careful. You should know which drugs can cause tachyphylaxis. So this is my last slide. So the take-home message is hypertension is a common cause of morbidity and disability worldwide. And reducing chronically increased BP using medication clearly reduces the incidence of coronary artery disease, stroke, congestive heart failure, and CKD. There are a lot of studies which has shown that it does reduce. And now the latest guidelines, cutoff point for diagnosis and treatment of hypertension, we saw that less than 120, 80 patient comes with some problem, you start a lifestyle modification. Now the latest is primordial prevention. Any person, any child or any adult follow this modification. And for primary prevention of cardiovascular complication, lowering BP is more important than the choice of drug. In the essence, it's not that you have to choose calcium channel blocker or a beta blocker or alpha blocker. Whatever it takes to reduce the BP, because cardiovascular complication doesn't depend drug dependent, but it is the reduction of BP which is more important. Of course, it is very important in a renal failure or other scenarios what drug to choose. But suppose now I'm sitting in a Rajiv Gandhi hospital, I have only 2 drugs available. In a resource limited setting, we have 2 drugs available. Then I will choose one of the drug and give the patient. Okay, it's not that that is nothing like that. So for primary prevention of cardiovascular complication, any drug is okay. So this all you should keep in mind when you are talking about, when you are going for treatment of hypertension. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. I hope I was clear, and if you don't have any doubts, we can wind up the session.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yeah, tell me, ma.
Ma'am, how does obstructive sleep apnea cause hypertension?
It is like that metabolic syndrome, no? Obesity, dyslipidemia, all that. No, it is not just that obstructive sleep apnea. Then what they say is that snoring per se. So all this, it is a risk factor. So it's altogether that it causes hypertension. There's no clear factor, but obesity, dyslipidemia, all that is going to occur in that and this also. And second, they say, yes, when the patient is, when a person is snoring, there is episodes of hypoxia also. All this per se, they say, make them more prone to develop vascular diseases, vascular stiffness, and in turn hypertension.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, ma'am. So I think any more, ma'am? Any more thing? Okay, so I will wind up the session. I think I'll meet you all on Thursday with a different topic. Okay, thank you all. And I think